Welcome to the Legal CFO.
Today's episode is your caseload math. How many clients do you really need? Ryan Kimler, what's going on? Welcome back.
Thank you for having me. Excited to dive into this today and caseload management. Love it.
Oh, let's do it. Let's do it. So how can law firms figure out the number of cases or clients they need to be profitable?
Yes, absolutely. Well, one of the biggest KPIs that they're going to need to look at is their pricing and what does an average case look like for you? What is it worth to you? Okay. Now, if you're doing multiple practice areas, for example, I'm just going to throw out, let's just say you're doing criminal defense law and let's just say you're doing personal injury law. Your average case value there, you might be doing both of those things, but your average case value there could be vastly different. So you have to break out your average case value kind of by case type, if you will. But that's the number one KPI to start with is what is our average price? And if I sign a client today and I bring them in the door, what is that worth to us? Greatest place to start.
So what factors should be considered when setting revenue per case targets?
Yeah, so I think we've got to consider affordability for our clients, right? We've got to know if I set a price of, let's just say I'm doing defense and I really specialize in DUIs. We've got to know where that break point is where, a good portion of the clients would say, no, I can't afford that to have you take care of my DUI, right? Now, a number that might be, $15,000, right? That we can't charge that for a DUI case, right? I don't really know what a case like that goes for today, maybe $5-6 grand, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But we've got to know where's that break-even point? Where is the point that we really can't go beyond? And then we can get down to, and evaluate. You can even evaluate yourself against other lawyers in the community. Maybe if you can get some prices, some lawyers down the street might have a little bit less experience than you, might not get as good of results as you. Obviously, you could charge a little bit more than that. Or than them, right? But making sure that we're in that spot where not too many people are saying no because of price. Good rule of thumb that I like to use is probably around 20%. If 20% turn you down for price, I don't think that's a bad problem to have. But we've definitely got to consider that. And then we also can't be too low. We've got to kind of get in and figure out, what's it really going to take for most cases for us to get that done? Especially if you're doing things on a flat rate, right? I would highly recommend still track your hours so that we can assign hourly rates to it and come down to what, summing all those hours up, what did we really spend on this case, right? So with some built-in profitability, hopefully, right?
Yeah.
So we've got to consider what it takes us to do it internally, and we've got to consider the external factors of what people are willing to pay and what's too cheap.
Well, you mentioned it, but let's talk about flat fee versus hourly. How do these, how do case type billing models, affect these different types of calculations?
Either way, I still want to get down to what's an average case worth for me. Now, if you're doing a flat fee and, let's just say you're doing estate plans, because I know those are commonly flat fee type work, then it's really easy to set revenue goals and case volume goals, right? If I'm doing $5,000 for an estate plan for a couple, and I want to make $500K in revenue, well, it's easy. Divide those two numbers, right? It means you got to do 100 plans over the course of a year, right?
Right.
Now, on the hourly side, you've got to go, if I want to make $500K and I'm charging at $500 an hour, again, you just divide, right? I've got to bill and collect 1,000 hours, right? And so then you could break it down. Well, if I've got to collect 1,000 hours, how many cases is that for me? If I'm doing, I don't know, if I'm doing divorces, right? Because those are normally billed hourly. And let's just say I'm billing at $500 an hour. How many hours on average am I putting into a divorce case? If it's 10, just to make the numbers round and easy, right? And I've got to bill 1,000 hours, that means 100 cases, right? So you kind of back into things a little bit. You kind of back into the math a little bit to kind of get down to how many cases you need to have. But let's just say that it's 100 cases over the course of the year. That if that's what you're building to, then we can divide that into, well, there's 12 months in a year. Easier math would have been if you needed 120 cases a year, then it's, 10 a month. But 100 cases a year, it's about 8, okay? Or you could say 8.5, right? So you can back into how many new cases do I need to start each month? And hopefully, as you're working these cases, you're closing at about the same rate, right? If you're not closing at the same rate, you're not going to be able to sustain continuing to open 8 cases a month. You're gonna run out of time to work these cases. So at that point, you're probably looking at hiring some additional help if you're not closing at about the same rate you want to open at.
So money is awesome, but what's the risk of taking too many clients, or maybe even not enough? But I would say there has to be something if you're overwhelmed or have way too many people.
For sure. So there is a real sweet spot to hit here, right? With how many cases we're opening, how many cases we're closing. Knowing those two figures and facts, really, really important to know. And really for each practice area. So if you're doing divorces, how many of them are you closing on a regular monthly basis? Or how many of them are you opening brand new on a regular monthly basis? Because not being in your sweet spot for capacity, obviously if you're under capacity, that's really going to affect profitability. And if you're so far under that you're really lacking, the revenue and the dollars coming in, that's really going to affect your ability to pay bills and pay your staff if you've got staff, right? Pay for marketing to bring in new cases. Being under your capacity really, really can put you in a tough spot. And especially if you've got debt on the business. I know a lot of law firms took on like COVID loans, things like that. Now, usually the rate's really low, but you still have payments to make on those loans, right? And you probably still need to pay yourself to live life too, right? And pay your own bills. So being under capacity could be a big problem. And then we could go to the other extreme of being, really, really over capacity. Deadlines creep up on you. You're doing things last minute, super high stress, right? Probably a lot of money in the door, but again, probably risking missing a deadline, not giving the client the service that you want, which could affect your firm's reputation. So both sides of the spectrum here, if we're not in that sweet spot of opening enough cases and closing enough cases and staying within the capacity limits that we want to, really have big risks on either side of that spectrum.
So how do you in your company help law firms plan their pipeline to avoid, those feast or famine cycles you were talking about?
For sure. Yeah. First thing is we're getting down to some of that math we talked about earlier. What does a case look like for us on average, right? What is that going to bring us in revenue dollars? How much is that going to be? What's our pricing on that? And then from there, we can start to look at capacity, right? If you're the owner and let's just say you've got, 2 attorneys on staff that have some experience, you can, by working with them, you can kind of know, well, how many cases does it take for them to have a full plate, right? Not where they're overworked and, oh my gosh, I got to do overtime in order to keep up, but also not where they're slow and just leaving, at noon on Friday because they're done, right? You can look at it and know how many cases do they need to have a full week. And so from there, we can start looking at, well, what's our build to? What is our goal? How many open cases do we have today? And what's our build to? What is our goal, right? In some circumstances, I run into a client and they're over their build to, right? Maybe their build to is 40 open cases at a time for this one specific practice area, and maybe they're at 50. Well, that means we probably need to turn down the rate that we're opening a little bit and let a few of them close so we can kind of stair step that down back to 40, right? And then at that point, we can really open the gates and we can open at the same rate we close. And so starting to track that on a monthly basis and knowing like, what's your plus minus number? Did you open more or did you close more, right? And then in other circumstances, we're under what our build to is, right? So maybe we want to build to that 40. Maybe we've only got 28 open. So we've still got to track what's our plus minus number, but we also want to set a timeline of how long is it going to take us to basically get to plus 12, right? Because 28 adding 12 gets us to that 40. So, maybe we want to take that on over the course of 4 months. And that means our goal for each month is we've got to be plus three cases, opening 3 more cases than we're closing, right? So getting down to what's that goal number, what's that, within our capacity, and also feeding us enough that we're feeding the business, right? And putting enough money into the business, and then starting to track our plus minus number and look at our open dates, our close dates. Another thing I think we'll get to that really goes into that, but is also knowing what's the timeline on a case on average. How long does a case take on average, right? That's going to help and kind of project out if I open a case today, when is it going to close?
So what are a few simple KPIs firms can use to, track whether their caseload supports their revenue goals?
For sure. Yes. So for starters, we've got to know a couple data points. We've got to know open and close dates so that we can track those plus minus numbers like I just talked about.
Yeah.
And then from there, we've really got to look at, if you're doing things on a flat rate basis, we've really got to look at, okay, what's the capacity of this attorney? How many cases can they handle in a year? Multiply that by our flat rate, and what are they generating revenue wise, right? Taking that revenue divided by their salary. So if they can generate 500K, their salary is 150, divide those two numbers out, right? And get down to, we're at a 3x return or what have you, right? A little bit over 3. But tracking and figuring out what's my return on payroll is going to be one of your biggest KPIs that you need to track. Forbes did a study. I think I've shared this last year, but 70% of expenses was labor. So on average for the small business. So obviously, our goal is to really be under that because if you are 70% labor, that only leaves you 30% to pay your other bills and to have profits. That's not a lot. So we've got to be under that 70% mark. How do we get there? You've got to have 3 and 4x returns on the staff that you've got, right? There's an old school rule in legal. You wanted a 3x return on your people. 1/3 of the money went to payroll, 1/3 goes to overhead, 1/3 goes to profit. Really old school rule, kind of works today, kind of doesn't. But you've got to have those returns and be able to track that so that your firm can stay healthy and that you can really build enough cases in there that you're going to have that return, right? If you're doing the math and you're like, oh man, I can only get to a 2x return with this attorney, then something's got to give. Either number one, you're overpaying that attorney, or number two, it's time that you raise prices, and then that's where you got to evaluate there. Can I raise prices? Can my clients take that, right? And some of it you might have to experiment and try, right? But if you can't get more than a 2x return on your staff that you have, that's going to put you at 50% payroll costs. And that's definitely going to hurt.
We talked about, small caseloads, large caseloads, what each firm needs based on what they can handle. But what can you give us one step a firm can take like today to get a clearer picture and how many cases they actually need?
Best first step is look at your expenses. What are our expenses? And hopefully you have financials from last year by this point, right? You could just look at last year. What was our total expense line number? If you're a small law firm, and let's just say you had $1 million in expenses. All right. From there, that you've got to make more than $1 million in revenue if you're going to keep the same expenses, right? So first easy step is look at your expenses, and then you've got to build to a revenue greater than that in order to have a profit. And so let's just say for the owner, let's just say that you wanted to have a $300,000 profit and that's what you were paying yourself with. Let's just assume no debt. Again, if you had $1 million in expenses, you've got to build to 1.3, right? And then from there, if you know what your cases are worth on average, you can back into, well, how many $5,000 DUI cases does my firm and I have to handle in order to get to 1.3? And you can, break that down on a monthly basis. So that's going to let you know how many you've got to open, how many have got to be closing, right? So you can kind of back into the math in that way. But I really like looking at it from a profit perspective so that we know what's that going to give us for an end result. What are we going to make on the goal that we set for the number of cases that we're bringing in?
So before I get you out of here, let's get down to brass tacks. Ryan, what's your favorite Dwight Schrute moment of The Office, brother? I'm not sure this is going to even stay in the cut, but we might as well get it on. We might as well get it on while we're recording. What's your favorite Dwight Schrute moment?
I have two. So first of all, number one is fire drill. Where he lights up a cigarette, he throws it in the trash can and says, "Today, smoking is going to save lives." And then there's a ton of chaos that happens because he did a little more backstory. He did a training on fire safety and no one paid attention, and it upset him. So that is first and foremost. That is my top moment. Moment number two would be when he's escorting to the hospital, and he jumps in his car, and I think it's him and Michael, and I think Michael's taking Pam to the hospital, if I remember correctly. And they pull out of the lot, and he just stops randomly. He's like, "Michael, that's where I saw that deer, right there," right, or something like that. And he points out the window, and he's just and he puts his police slide on top, and then the police pull him over and say, "Dwight, you're not a cop," right? Those two moments are my favorite two moments, by far, hands down.
That's amazing.
It's funny.
Thank you so much for joining us, Ryan. I appreciate you taking the time and giving everyone your insight. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Love it.
And thank you all for joining us. Thank you for listening to the Legal CFO with Ryan Kimler. If you're ready to get financial clarity for your law firm, visit netprofitcfo.com. Don't forget to like, follow, leave a review, subscribe, share this with people that might need this information, because the more you know, the more you grow. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.